Today we're going to try something that's not exactly a bush plane, but one that I'm familiar with, P-51 Model D Mustang. So we're going to do startup, taxi, we'll do one circuit, and landing and shutdown. Now, as always, there's checklists to follow, radio calls to make, pre-flight to do, engine run-up. However, because this is for sim pilots, we'll keep it just down to engine controls and just the basics. Later on, if people ask, we can do this much more realistically, like you would do it for real with radio calls and everything else that I mentioned. But for now, we're just going to do the basics. So let's get into the thing. So P-51 is the V12 Merlin engine, so this is definitely high-performance aircraft. It's relatively easy to fly, but you have to fly in the numbers. There's very little room for mistakes. It's not very forgiving. The wings, the aircraft, relatively small for the amount of horsepower. So we'll start going through the controls clockwise. Flap lever, full up position. Now the flaps aren't coming up because they're hydraulically operated. Ram air forward, carb heat full cold, elevator trim to take off. And because of the large engine torque, we'll do about between 6 to 12 degrees right rudder trim. Next, propeller full forward, crack the throttle for starting, aiming at an idle of about 1,000 to 1,200 RPM. Mixture is 3 positions. That's emergency rich, normal, operating, and cutoff. So we'll start it in the cutoff position. That's the supercharger switch, fuel boost dilution switch for cold engine starts, starter switch, and the primer. Set the mags to both, master fuel on, and we'll choose the left tank for starting. That's the gauge for the hydraulic pressure for the flaps, and the pressure relief will pull when we do a shutdown. Uncage the artificial horizon. There's the engine gauges. We'll keep an eye on them when we start. Manifold pressure and RPM. So we'll work our way over, and might as well close the canopy. Once we get the canopy closed, we'll do a control movement check, make sure the controls, aileron, rudder, elevator are free and clear. So we'll go right aileron, left aileron, right aileron on the other side. Check the elevator over his shoulder and the rudder. Now we have our feet on the toe brakes for starting. Generator on, master battery on. Check that, flick on the fuel boost pump and you can see the fuel pressure comes up. So now we can prime the engine. We'll prime for 5-10 seconds. And remember, we're starting with the mixture off, just running on the prime fuel so we don't flood the engine. As soon as we get it running, which it is now, we flick the mixture to full rich. Parking brake on so we can take our feet off. Check the RPM. We'll up the throttle a bit, get it up to between 1 and 1,200 RPM. Check the gauges, oil pressure's up, fuel pressure, and the temperature will rise very quickly. It's a liquid-cooled engine, so we have to get air over the radiator. Now the control stick unlocks the tail wheel. So full back will lock it, so it'll move a few degrees with the rudder for takeoff and landing. And for taxiing, push the stick forward and it'll put it into full caster. And that way you can steer and at very low speed using differential braking. So a bit of throttle, pull back to idle. We'll hit a bit of right brake just to kick us around, and we'll get lined up on the runway. Now on takeoff, because of the massive amount of horsepower, you can easily overboost the engine. So we'll run at full power until we get a positive rate of climb, and pull the manifold pressure back down to about 46 inches, and then course out the prop to just about 35, 36 RPM, 100 RPM. So up we go, positive rate of climb, throttle back, manifold pressure to about 46 inches, and raise the gear. Now airspeed's critical. We don't want to go too fast. We want to get that gear up before we increase the airspeed too much. Propeller back to just the top part of the green arc, and fly the aircraft. So we're doing just a rough circuit here. Now our fuel boost pump's still on. We'll shut that off once we get into a normal cruise. So we're going to throttle back just to the top of the green arc, so about 35 inches manifold pressure, and leave the RPM where it is, right at the top of the green arc. So the gear is up, and we still have that rudder trim, so we'll start taking it off now that we're in level flight. So we're at cruise setting, power settings, starting our turn to swing back for the downwind. Now because it's a high performance aircraft, slowing it down is tricky. So what we're going to do just for fun is we'll get some permission from the tower, and we'll do a low fly over the field and reduce the power on the descent, and we'll keep the power low and climb out again to get our airspeed down so we can enter the base for landing on the runway. So we've got permission to do our low flyover. We'll pull the power down to the bottom of the green arc to about 25 inches manifold pressure. Prop setting remains the same. Airspeed's climbing up to pushing 300 knots. And the airfield's beside us, so let's pull up, leave the power setting where it is, and bleed off some of the airspeed. So we'll climb up to about 500 feet above field elevation. Once we get the airspeed down to about 190, we can put our first degree of flap down. It'll slow the plane down quickly, and then progressively add more flap. And once we're down to about 110 knots, we drop the gear. So we've left the fuel boost pump on. Normally we'll shut it off for cruise. And we'll start our base leg turn. Dropping more flap as we lose speed, and then pretty soon we'll drop the gear. Now the gear in transit is indicated by a red light, which just came on there now. And once the gear is down, the green light comes on. So now the gear is checked down. Airspeed's about 120, which is good. And pretty soon we'll push the propeller to full fine, or full forward lever. There we go. And throttle back. And set up our descent to about 110 knots. And line up with the runway. Now we want the propeller full fine in case we have to power up and climb out again, just like any other aircraft with a constant speed prop. Now we're going to descend between 100 and 110 knots over the threshold at 100 and flare at 90, and it'll set down. And It'll land on 3-point landing pretty nicely. You can land just on the main gear. It's your choice. Today we don't have much wind, so we'll do a 3-pointer. So we're at 110 knots, dropping to 100 over the threshold, throttle back, pitch up, and get it down onto the field at 90 knots. Now, because the center of gravity is big engine far forward of the wheels, braking very, very slight. You don't want to nose over. So you're pulsing the brakes very light on and off. If you push on the brakes and hold it, you'll nose over. So be patient. Use rudder to keep it straight down the runway. Stick full back to lock the tail wheel so it doesn't caster on you. And once we get it stopped, we can unlock the tail wheel, use a bit of right brake, a bit of throttle, and we can backtrack to the taxiway. So a bit of right brake, stick forward, release the tail wheel, and very slowly get it around. If you're a little too abrupt, you'll end up spinning around doing a 360. And then once you're going in the right direction, stick back, lock the tail wheel, because it does steer with the rudder several degrees either way, which if you just want to steer a little bit, it's much more stable. So we're going to go down this taxiway and do a full stop and go through the engine shutdown procedure. Now, normally, of course, checklists, radio calls, and we wouldn't do a shutdown on a taxiway. We'd park it on the apron. So again, gentle on the braking, make sure you don't nose over. Come to a full stop, we'll put the parking brake on, make sure we're idling slowly. Parking brake. Now, like any carbureted aircraft, oh yeah, good idea, we'll get the canopy open because it does get warm. So we'll get it open to cool off. And like any carbureted aircraft, you can shut off the engine by shutting the fuel to the carb with the mixture lever. And let the engine spin down. And once we do that, shut the mags off, master fuel off, generator and battery switches off, and got the mags off. And hydraulic pressure, you can see on the gauge, is positive reading there. So let's pull the release just to depressurize the system. So the flaps are dropped down. Now we got the starter closed and fuel boost off. And the trims and so on we can set during the next startup. So there's the flaps down. Everything looks pretty good, secure. And that's it. That's the P-51D.